As lazy gardeners, this right here is exactly what we want. But all rainstorms are not created equal. Just like all the different ways we might water our gardens artificially are also not equal. Let's talk about it. Everyone's soil is a little bit different, and every region's rainfall is different too. Those differences will massively influence the way we think about water retention, water disbursement, and how we will artificially water our gardens. But as lazy gardeners, our goal is to get our soil to the point that we have to water as little, if at all, as possible. Some people have sandy soil, which water will flow right through, and it's actually hard to get water to stick around long enough so your plants can get a drink. Some people have clay soil, or their soil's been super compacted, which will make it really hard for water to actually penetrate and get down to where the roots of our plants actually live. But water runoff, and also just having water sit stagnantly on the soil surface, can also be an issue there as well. So we might put a ton of water on our garden, but if we do it all at once, what happens? It all just flows away or collects on the surface. Even if we have truly fantastic soil, but it ever actually gets too dry, it becomes what we like to call hydrophobic, afraid of water. And that will make water just bounce right off it unless we slowly and very deliberately rehydrate it so water can get down inside it again. When we were all younger, we were taught that plants needed 3 things to survive. They needed soil, sunlight, and water. I've seen so many beginner gardeners wanting to give their little baby plants absolutely the best start in life, drown their plants by giving it too much of a good thing. Because here's the thing, plants absolutely do need water to survive, but plant roots also need to breathe. How good are you at breathing underwater? Plants also suck at that. A sponge is actually the best metaphor I've found to help us understand the desired moisture content and actual texture of our soil that we're going for as gardeners. If you pick up a handful of soil in your garden and you squeeze it like this, if you're squeezing water out, you're giving your plants too much of a good thing, aka you're watering them way too much. Your soil, just below the soil surface, should feel moist to the touch, but should never really be any moister than that. And that is the grossest word ever, but unfortunately it's the best one we have in the English language for this topic. So if we were to wring all of the water out of this sponge, we actually now have the perfect growing environment for our plants because we've got plenty of air for those roots to breathe, but it's nice and moist, which is going to help seeds germinate. This level of moisture content is going to encourage all kinds of little creepy crawlies, microbes, and funguses, and all the things that we actually need to keep our soil alive in a way that it's going to best support, sustain, and help our plants really thrive. Even expert gardeners often have a hard time figuring out exactly how to maintain this level of moisture content, even if you have super expensive fancy setups and you have hoses going and timers and all these things. But guess where you can find soil that feels just like this, even in the middle of a massive drought? The forest. And so instead of investing in a whole bunch of fancy watering gizmos, how about we as lazy gardeners spend a little time observing the garden that takes care of itself and use that as our model as we design and care for our own gardens as well. So if you look around in my garden, you will probably notice it looks a lot different than most other gardens you've probably ever seen. And that is literally because I've used the forest as my guide. So why don't we go take a look around and talk about the 3 biggest mistakes most people are making in watering their garden and how we as lazy gardeners can avoid that altogether. By the way, we are currently on calf watch right now. And so allow me a quick diversion to go check on sweet Ella. I do have 18 cows, so if you're falling for more than just the garden stuff and you want to see a bunch of cute animal content, make sure you're not missing that because, let's be honest, I mean, gardening's fine or whatever, but animals are really where it's at. By the way, check out the sweet waiting room I made for my maternity ward over here. I really am everyone's favorite neighbor. Ella, would you please hurry up, girl? This is getting ridiculous. There are so many ups and downs in farming. I do genuinely believe though that farming is turning me into the kind of person I ultimately want to be. Which brings me to the sponsor of today's video, BetterHelp. I found BetterHelp during the pandemic when I needed a virtual source to talk about a particularly hard thing that I was going through. And all I had to do to suddenly have someone to talk to was fill out a little quiz online. And for people like me who really struggle to do all of the administrative tasks that are involved with finding a therapist, BetterHelp does so much of that stuff for us. Appointments happen virtually from the comfort of my very own farm. I schedule them at my convenience from my phone. And for the better part of the last several years, Monday nights, I settle in with my cup of tea and I chat with my therapist about life. In fact, my poor therapist actually nearly witnessed a goat birth one time when our appointment coincided with a goat birth, which actually might happen again if this carries on too much longer. If you're struggling with something and you think that talking to someone about it will help, check out BetterHelp. And if you use the code AnnabelleTrades, it will get you 10% off of your first month of therapy. It's taken me a few years to get my soil to the place that it currently is, which is we were just able to sustain a 90-day drought without having to pull out the hose one single time, and, you know, things are still doing pretty okay. And the best part about that is that I have been able to achieve that level of soil health where the garden takes care of itself with Mother Nature's rain as our guide completely for free. I was, in fact, raised by one of the cheapest humans alive, so thriftiness is always next to godliness. My motivation in coming up with the absolute laziest ways to take care of my garden is actually because though so many beginner gardeners will care too much about their garden and water it too much or too often, I often forget that my garden even exists, so my plants would just sit in the ground and wither and die because no one was caring for them. 5 years ago, I started going into the forest to look for mushrooms almost every day, and by accident, I noticed a lot of what was going on with waterfall and rainfall because that affected the mushrooms that would actually grow and when. And I was able to bring those lessons back to my garden. And the first and most important one, as we're thinking about water retention in the soil, so capturing and storing whatever rainfall comes, is right here. If you look at my garden beds, you should never, ever, ever, ever see soil that is uncovered. Because what color is soil? Soil is black, which when the sun beats down on it, as is currently happening to me with my black shirt, it gets really, really hot and things start to evaporate, like all of the water that I just drank. And we don't want that on our gardens. So it just makes sense to me that we keep our garden soil covered up. A lesson I learned and then relearned about 10,000 times after moving to Tennessee is that water flows downhill. That is especially relevant when we think about our garden soil being a sponge. Here in Tennessee, we get huge, heavy rainfalls that offer far more water than even my super spongy soil can actually absorb. And in that, I knew that that water had to go somewhere. And this is yet another way that I tried really hard to emulate nature in the way I designed my garden pathways. It's not just a super cool visual feature that these rows are perfectly perpendicular to my barn. It's actually because I was thinking about the fact that water flows downhill that I designed my garden pathways the way that I did. The best advice I've ever gotten as a farmer was to observe your land during different weather patterns and then build your infrastructure to match it, rather than just building the infrastructure you want and hoping for the best. And this is a perfect example of sitting in a lawn chair, drinking some slug bait, and watching what happens when the rain falls. This right here is the topmost corner of my garden. Everything in here is designed to keep water flowing off of my plants when it rains too much, and to slow the flow of water down as much as possible, to direct it where I want it to go, and ultimately to keep the water on my property in the form of this beautiful If you look at it from far enough away, fishing pond that my pigs helped me build. It's still a bit of a work in progress. All of my garden beds are humps that, in the event of a fast, heavy rainfall event, will allow the water to fall off of the garden bed and away from the plant roots and stop the plants from actually drowning. But those then go into the garden pathways, which are full of pretty big pieces of wood chips, aka mulch, that are themselves basically little sponges that will soak up that rainfall and disperse it later, slowly over time. But also, all of these vertical beds and pathways are then directing the water down to a swale that is basically just another bump that directs water down this pathway, slows it, and basically makes the water do a little zigzag from here to here. And as that is all happening, it then comes all the way down here to the lowest part in the garden, which is where it then empties into the pond. And this is actually kind of a bad example if you think about watering, because it's a dead tree, but that has nothing to do with water and everything to do with girdled roots. I am not above admitting my mistakes, and to that end, I planted this fruit tree incorrectly. Then, because of sunk cost bias, I had a professional arborist come try to fix it and help me replant it, and he told me it was gonna die, but I didn't want to believe him, and I'm still holding out till spring to see if it really died, but I'm pretty sure it's dead. Back to the watering. I now want you, dear cameraman, to flip around and see the angle that we are at currently to the barn. See how everything is uphill from where we are? Because my plants receive so little love or attention, except when I'm actually coming to harvest fruit from them, like this okra, I probably wouldn't really notice that a plant actually needed something from me, like this plant telling me that it's thirsty. But even right now, we've just finished peak afternoon heat, so it is obviously a little stressed from the sun and the heat and everything else. And I would actually wait till this plant was even droopier, almost to the point where it looked like it was about to die, before I actually wanted to water it. And there's a couple reasons for this. First, because the less that you water the plant, it's going to go in search of water. And that basically means it's going to have deeper, longer, better roots that are going to spread out and find whatever they need. In the process of looking for water deep beneath the soil surface, it will also find all kinds of nutrients and other minerals that, if it just had a really shallow root system, because I was watering it every single day and it didn't struggle at all, I would also have to provide for it. So, you know, don't water it, win, win, win. We are nearing golden hour here, which is my favorite part of the evening, and that leads me to the next big mistake I see so many people making when it comes to watering their garden. Watering at the wrong time of day. Watering your plants at the beginning, or even worse, the middle of the day, is not only a huge waste of water, because so much of that water is going to evaporate in the process of sprinkling or whatever it is you're doing, or literally just off the soil surface as the soil heats up, but also droplets of water on your plant leaves will magnify the sun's pressure and give them a sunburn. The leaves of a plant are its solar panels. These are what allows the plant to capture the sun's essence and turn it into delicious morsels for our mouths, just like this okra, which will be fried in some pig lard later, and it'll be delicious. But when a plant's leaves are damaged like this, the plant then expends a ton of energy trying to fix its solar panels, instead of expending that very same energy making delicious fruit. Oh my gosh, look at this like very cranky little frog on my popcorn. Oh buddy, so cute. These guys especially are always on the gate handles and things when I'm going in and out of the animal pens, and they scare the living daylights out of me, because it's like I was expecting to touch metal and instead I touched that. When I was showing you my beautiful garden pathways with the big sticks, the keenest of eyes could possibly have noticed all of this, what probably looks to the untrained eye like mold, going on in my wood chips. All of these white little hairs and things are the early signs of decomposition, which is the cause of molds, funguses, microorganisms that are eating the carbohydrates out of these wood chips and turning them into insect frass, also known as poop, which is great fertilizer. But ultimately what's happening here is because these wooden pathways are in little valleys between my garden beds, water does tend to accumulate and stay in there. Not just because these wood chips are little sponges, but also just because gravity happens. And in that, if we allow these larger pieces of wood chips to decompose the way that they literally naturally will in moist conditions, there's our favorite word again, I will already have next year's garden bed mulch right here in the pathway where I can just rake it on and replace these chips, and bada bing, bada boom, we can keep the system growing and constantly add more and more organic matter. Unless, of course, we accidentally kill all of the microbial and fungal activity by using the wrong kind of water, which is the third biggest mistake I see so many gardeners making just because they're not aware how treated water can actually affect all of the mycelial and microbial life that really helps us in the long run in our garden. When I realized just how heavily treated our Nashville city water was, I started getting really serious about finding other ways to collect rainwater, because in general, rainwater is always going to be better for fungal and microbial activity, because what the earth produces naturally is going to be a lot better than what we chemically treat, just as a rule of thumb. But I also realized that things like this are not actually as practical as one might hope. As useful as this little spigot is for filling buckets for making homemade fertilizer and stuff like that, I can't just hook a hose into this and then spray my garden to water it if I do need to germinate a seed bed, or if I do have an especially thirsty plant that I want to keep alive for whatever reason. So I started looking into other options. And when I started to get really serious about composting and making compost tea, I found out that a lot of the chemicals that are used to treat city drinking water will actually off-gas if left for 24 hours, or if you're adding bubbles to it, which makes it off-gas faster. Getting rid of those chemicals from certain kinds of treated water, however, can also be, my goodness, the gnats, can also be done faster by adding vitamin C powder, which worked really well for me here because of what they use to treat our water with. And I made a casual mention to that in one of my other videos, which actually sparked a really fascinating comment thread on that video. And because I'm severely dyslexic and can't actually read it aloud to you, I will just pop it up on screen and you can do some further research yourself. One thing the forest does that a lot of gardeners and farmers don't to increase the soil's water permeability is forests don't monocrop. Even though you see my beautiful burgeoning popcorn crop right here, I hope you also see that it is interplanted with amaranth, okra, vining plants like cucumbers, some zinnias that planted themselves from last year's flowers, and of course, some strawberries, which grow nice and close to the ground and keep the soil shaded really well. Which, by the way, doesn't just keep the roots of plants cool on the hottest days of the year. It also keeps the soil below nice and cool, which also helps less of the moisture that's contained within the soil to evaporate off the soil, which ultimately helps with water retention. But also, all of those different plants have different roots that permeate this soil at different thicknesses, to different depths, and then will connect to the mycelial, aka mushroom roots, and microbial network, which is then going to stimulate even more nutrient mining and nutrient sharing between plants. This is also an extremely space-efficient way to garden. And so those of us who are gardening in small spaces are then able to grow more nutrient-dense calories in less space. And I say those of us growing in small spaces because though I am now growing in a much bigger space. My gardening and farming journey in general started in the city, and I planted a garden so I'd know where my next meal was coming from. Even though I'm all for letting plants struggle and sending deeper roots and all of that stuff, there are some plants that just have shallower roots to begin with, and also really don't like to struggle quite as much, especially as the weather starts getting hotter. And the way that I address that is the exact same way the forest does. I plant those more tender things with shallower root systems that are going to need a little bit more water near the soil surface, under the shade of a bunch of other things. And that's exactly where the idea of this trellis system came from. As mulch as I believe in the power of keeping our soil covered, please don't shake the camera while you're shaking your head at me, dear cameraman. I also think that planting different layers of plants is super helpful for so many other reasons as well. It's more space efficient, obviously. It helps shade the soil, which helps keep it more moist and everything like that. But it also allows us to eke a whole lot longer of a season out for our most tender little things like lettuces, which I personally don't like eating solid, but my cows do, and they turn it into delicious ribeye steaks, so that's worth something. Beyond thinking about frequency when it comes to the amount that we're watering our garden, because truly, it is so much better to water your garden deeply, more sporadically, than to water a little bit more often. If we were to think about the seasonality of what actually happens in nature with rain in most places, and then try to emulate that, we are going to massively increase both the size and quality of our harvests. Let me explain. In most places in the early spring, it rains a ton, which allows plants to get really well established as far as growing lots of roots, growing lots of foliage above the soil, all great things. But as the summer progresses, most places start getting less rainfall and higher temperatures. And then as we transition into fall, we have even less water and even higher temperatures, and then the days start getting shorter and everything starts to wind down and get ready for winter. The best lazy gardeners learn how to emulate nature in every respect. If we're thinking about what plants actually have to do year after year to survive, and we think about how rainfall and changing weather patterns actually relate to the life cycle of a plant, we can then be much better waterers, or non-waterers as it happens, as well. If we have a really fancy irrigation setup that is kind of a set-in-forget-it thing, which will water our gardens for the same amount of time every single day throughout the entire gardening season, that's going to send your plants the signal that it is early spring all gardening season long. Which for short season crops like lettuces, which do have a really small root structure and their entire job is just producing foliage above the ground and no fruit, that's mostly fine. But if we are thinking about the long-term plans of propagating the species, and again, I was raised by one of the cheapest humans alive, so I don't really like to buy seeds every year. So when I'm thinking about wanting to actually create my own seeds, I also still, even with these guys, I still want to simulate the seasonal changes, because what happens when the weather starts getting too hot for lettuce to taste lettucey anymore is that the plant will start to bolt, which creates really gross tasting lettuce, but also really great seeds that we can then plant, or better still, let actually seed in place and then spread those seeds naturally and leave them in the seed bank so that they can replant themselves and pop up next year, like we have going on over here. By the way, I myself have not personally put lettuce seeds in that bed for 3 years. They just keep showing back up and proliferating on their own. Due, of course, to the fact that in true lazy gardening fashion, I have let nature take its course. Anyways, when it comes to fruiting plants, and this doesn't just apply to fruit, so if you don't grow fruit, pay attention still, because this matters. All of the flavor that comes from a piece of fruit is actually in the initial fruit bud. The more we water, in kind of theory, the bigger the fruit will get, which if you're going for harvest pound by pound, I guess is fine. But if you're going for complexity and deliciousness of flavor, is not fine, because we don't want the delightful flavor of this grape to be dispersed into a plum-sized grape. We want it all in this tiny little morsel, because there's more room in our tummy for more of these that taste way more delicious, like this. And this also applies to those of you who have a much shorter growing season, because if you are watering your garden too much, it's very likely that without reducing your watering at the end of the season, your fruit will never actually ripen. And by the way, this is wisdom that comes from a winemaker I once knew that was talking about the importance of flavor complexity in grapes. But having grown peaches and other fruits for almost 12 years as well, the rule about not wanting to water our fruit too much so that it's more flavor disbursement definitely applies to those as well. Delightful. If you, like me, are very interested in growing things like extremely hot peppers for hot sauce and/or tomatoes, seasonal watering is especially important, because if we don't start to taper off our watering near the end of the season, the plant is not going to be nearly as motivated to create seeds in the form of its fruit, and those fruits will never actually ripen. And so the real roulette of all of this is figuring out the exact right time to stop watering entirely, to absolutely make sure that your plant puts on the maximum number of fruits and that they ripen as quickly as possible. And to be totally honest with you, some years I do a whole lot better at that than others. And right over here, I can show you a funny example of that happening way too early in the season because I wasn't quite paying attention. Come here. Right here we have a really funny example of what I was talking about with seasonal watering gone kind of wrong. We had a super wet and rainy early spring, which is really... Yeah, you're okay. Welcome June to the garden. This is a somewhat new addition because she just got something called a jump gate to help us with a few of the garden pests that we couldn't otherwise get rid of. Sometimes she herself is one of them. We had an insanely wet, rainy early spring, which for plants in the nightshade family like tomatoes is a recipe for disaster when it comes to things like blight. Another argument for not watering our gardens as often if we are artificially watering them. But because it was so rainy and wet and I wanted to mitigate how much water was actually getting onto these plants, I put all these pots on an angle in hopes that they would actually drain even more of the water away from the foliage. And it worked so well that we have an early season forced ripening and like seed putting on of this plant. Unfortunately, that happened though before the plant had created enough solar panels to create a bunch more fruit. So, you know, probably a real win for better tasting fruit really early in the season, because boy howdy has this fruit struggled, and it will be all the sweeter for it. But you know, for production's sake, not the best plan. Mostly because I forgot to ever upright them and they quickly died in our recent drought. But back over here in my first year lazy garden, we actually have a really good example of a tomato plant that was affected by blight, a fungus that happens because of too much moisture and too little airflow, often because we're watering our plants too much in the spring. You can see that as the weather dried up and the rain stopped coming, this plant was still able to stay healthy enough to produce a ton of fruit, and it's certainly not done yet. All right. I do want to expand a little bit on why exactly we want to let our plants suffer a little bit and send out deeper, wider root systems. Because going back to our sponge analogy, the more roots that spread out in our soil, the more little organic pathways we're making into the soil, which is going to help with water permeation when it actually does rain. That's more organic material going out into the soil, so that when we then harvest and chop and drop and leave everything to decompose in place, that's more nutrients that are going to then be re-released into the soil around it. Those roots, while living, are going to be little fingers holding the soil in place. So if we have a big, huge rain event all at once, we're not going to have all of the fertility in our soil, or even our soil beds themselves, wash down the hill. The bigger the root system, the more nutrients, minerals, and everything else that the plant will be able to naturally collect, which then makes more nutrient-dense food, which then makes us healthier, so that we don't have to spend as much money or time or effort going to the doctor. But also, the bigger, wider the root system, the greater the potential to be able to soak up more water and more nutrients for the plant's own personal healing and growing abilities. And as I mentioned, a plant's foliage are its solar panels. The plants that are growing in our soil want to work in tandem with all of the microorganisms and fungi that will ultimately naturally show up if we start creating more water permeable, more constantly covered soil surfaces. And here's where things get really wild. The mycorrhizal fungi makes a phone-a-friend network with all of the plant roots, and then goes and finds all of the missing nutrients that the plant needs to better thrive, because the mycorrhizal fungi wants the plant to make as many leaves as possible, so that when the plant dies back, it will then leave more organic matter, aka more covering on top of the soil's surface. But that also means that the addition of even more leaves doesn't just mean there's more cover for the soil, there's also more carbohydrates for the fungus to eat and then multiply and start the whole process over. And this is when things really start to compound in our favor, because just like having more organic material on the soil's surface, having a larger, deeper, wider mycelial network, that's fancy talk for mushroom roots basically, and having more plant root pathways that then again, when those plants die, those little things start to decompose as a result of little microorganisms that then come and use the plant root system as a little micro highway to travel along and eat and fart and poop and create more fertility in the soil as they do that. Ultimately, we have to water less and less and less and less. And now I feel like I could really use some slug bait. Which, by the way, is a callback to our video, Get Rid of Pests in the Garden. Which, spoiler alert, one of the best ways to get rid of pests in your garden is to have plants with huge root systems that are able to produce more leaves, because then, with more leaves, if one of the leaves gets damaged, it's not actually going to compromise the health of the rest of the plant. So you've got a few things munching on your leaves, no problem. There's 10,000 more still there to keep the plant healthy. I did mention we're on calf watch, so every 2 hours we gotta pop back there and take a little peek. Ella! Oh my gosh, still eating. Come on. If you've made it this far in the video, I imagine that you like some level of silliness, frivolity, and possibly even animals. And if that's the case, one of my favorite videos that we've ever made that nobody ever watched was a video about doing cow chores in sub-zero temperatures while we tried to come up with a music-related name for our new bull. So, I will see you in that video. Cheers! Ella! You better poop out that baby soon. I really need to get some sleep tonight, girl. Oh, howdy, absolutely not. You little jerk! Come on! Oh my gosh.